Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Gamecore. So a few days ago I did a review of this controller here, which is called the BIGBIG Won Elitist S, and despite its terrible name, I gave it a pretty glowing review. I said it was my favorite controller for $45. But after posting that video, I learned something, and that is that people on the internet have opinions. And so I got something like 1 million comments, I think it was about 1 million comments, saying, hey, check out the 8BitDo Pro 2, because that's the one everyone's talking about. Well, joke's on you, because I've had this controller for like a week now, and I've been using it too, and I really like it. But there are some other things I really don't like about it. And to sum up how I feel about the 8BitDo Pro 2, I'm going to use one of my favorite sayings in the English language, and that is that a camel is a horse made by a committee. And if you've never heard of that before, don't worry, I'll explain it throughout this video. But all that being said, we're going to do a review here on the 8BitDo Pro 2. And I've actually only watched like 1 or 2 reviews about this controller. I know there are a ton of reviews out there about it, but I really want to make sure I give my own personal spin to this experience. So we'll go into depth about all the things I love to focus on with controllers, the feel of the buttons, the D-pad, the analog sticks, all that stuff. And yeah, we'll talk about connectivity and how it plays with games and all that too. What I want to have happen at the end of this video is for you to walk away knowing that if you have $50 to spend on a controller, which one is going to be the best one for you between these two controllers in particular. So we got a lot of work ahead of us, so let's jump right into it. So let's start with a quick unboxing. So just as a quick notice here, my mother-in-law was actually vacuuming in the house and I didn't notice it when I was recording a lot of this footage. So if you hear a vacuum in the background, it's not you going crazy, it was me just forgetting that there was a vacuum going. Anyway, onto the unboxing. I like the packaging on these 8BitDo controllers, but overall it's very simple. You've got your instruction manual, USB-C cable. Now, immediate impressions of this controller is that it feels very solid. And what I mean by solid is the fact that it doesn't feel hollow in any way. Like it feels like everything inside of it is completely filled. And I like that feeling, it feels very good. This is my first time ever holding an 8BitDo Pro controller, and it's kind of an odd feeling. Like they took an SNES controller and then just started adding stuff to it. But overall, it feels comfortable in the hands. Now looking at the back, you can see it has 2 rear buttons. And then it also has a control switch for different connection types. And there's 4 altogether. The first one is S for switch, then A for Apple, D for D input or Android, and then X for X input or Windows. I like that the grips in the controller have this kind of rough feel to them. I like this texture here. But yeah, overall, it feels solid to the touch and all the buttons are easy to access. And then the center button here is a profile button, so you can have multiple profiles on one controller. Now opening up the back, you can see it has its own replaceable battery. It says it's going to get about 20 hours of playtime from the 1000 milliamp hour battery, and the instructions say it's going to take about 4 hours to charge altogether. So like I was mentioning earlier, it's obvious that this controller was modeled after the original SNES controller. The D-pad seems almost identical, and then even the feel of the start and select buttons is very similar. Now the buttons also have that slick, glossy feel to them, but they don't have the same design as the Super Nintendo. They're all convex, as opposed to the Super Nintendo, which has both concave and convex buttons. Okay, so now let's compare button sizes. The 8BitDo Pro 2 is 10.49 millimeters, whereas the Super Nintendo is 10.54, so a little bit larger than the Pro 2. Again, keep in mind that the 8BitDo Pro 2 is 10.49 or 10.48 millimeters. Now another popular controller by 8BitDo is the SN30 Pro, and that's 10.43, so a little bit smaller. Same thing with PS4, it's 10.31, so even smaller than that. And then the Xbox controller is smaller than all of these. It comes out to be about 10.14 or so. Now the Switch Pro controller is larger, it's 10.74. And then just for giggles here, the 351p is 7.96, so tiny. Now I had a suspicion that one specific controller probably had the closest fit, and sure enough, it's the PS1 controller. You can see here it's 10.42. So all that being said, the buttons on the 8BitDo Pro 2 are somewhere between the size of the original Super Nintendo controller and the original PS1 controller. It's a pretty good size, it's a very classic size to me. Alright, let's talk about weight here. So this is 226 grams altogether. That's about a middle of the road weight. You can see here that the PS4 is 218 grams. And then the Switch Pro controller is 248. So in between those two as well. Now the Xbox One controller is 293 grams, so much heavier than all of these. Now interestingly enough, the Elitist S controller is exactly 226 grams as well. So it's the exact same weight between these two controllers. Okay, let's talk about button feel. These are not clicky buttons. They are mushy buttons, but they are very responsive and they bounce back very, very quickly. Comparing it to other controllers here, here's the Switch Pro controller. This one is much chunkier feeling, but is equally responsive. It bounces up very quickly. Same thing with the Xbox One S. These buttons are much more rounded, which has a completely different feel on your thumbs, but it also is responsive. Now comparably, I would say the PS4 controller is a little bit less responsive. It's a much lighter feeling button than the one in the 8BitDo Pro 2. Yeah, so overall, these are basically just middle of the road buttons. They're unique in their own way, but at the same time, they don't mimic any one specific controller. Now, one thing that is really odd to me is the coloring of these buttons. At first I thought, well, maybe they're like the Xbox One controller, which I haven't seen in a while, so I dusted off my son's Xbox One controller, and you can see here, the coloring does not match that one at all. Now, going back to the PS4 controller, the colors actually match, but they also don't match because they're rotated like 45 degrees to the right for some reason. So overall, the coloring on these buttons is just kind of weird, but they do have a black model, as well as another model that's modeled after the original Game Boy design. Okay, so let's talk about the feel of the D-pad. I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this because it's basically an SNES D-pad. To me, it seems a little bit stiffer than I would expect, but overall it just has that classic retro feel. Now this Super Nintendo controller here is actually from the SNES Mini, so it's a little bit different than the actual original controller, but you get a feel for the fact that they're very, very similar. Now the analog sticks on this are another story as well. They're very similar to the PS4 in terms of just the overall height of them, as well as how much resistance you have. But when it comes to the actual grippiness around the sides of them, it's identical to what's on the Xbox One. As you can see here, it has that same amount of grittiness around the edges, but the Xbox analog sticks are much higher off the controller than they are on this 8BitDo. Okay, so talking triggers for a second here, this feels just like a dead ringer to the PS4 triggers. So let's look at some other controllers. Here's the Nintendo Switch controller. Much less travel and definitely a digital input here. Now the Xbox One S definitely has that analog feel to it, but the shaping is nothing like on the 8BitDo Pro 2. And, as I suspected, the PS4 controller is almost exactly identical. Now looking at these shoulder buttons here, this is where things look a little bit odd to me, because straight up, these are just Super Nintendo's shoulder buttons. And then they're mixed with the PS4 triggers, and to me I don't feel like they're very cohesive, the both of them together like this. Now I kind of like these back buttons, they feel very good, they are definitely clicky, and they're a little bit easier to push on than I would like. I like my back buttons to be a little bit hard to push, that way I don't push on them accidentally. But yeah, overall, the feel of this controller feels nice, but when you start picking it apart, it's a little bit weird. This mixture of shoulder buttons and trigger buttons from two different controllers, to me, just doesn't feel like it matches very well. Let's compare this to the 8BitDo SN30 Pro. Now at face value, these seem very similar. They have the same analog sticks, they have the same start and select as well as the D-pad. Now these trigger buttons are definitely different, they have much less travel, and they have digital input. But the feel of an SN30 Pro seems cohesive to me. It feels a lot like a Super Nintendo controller that just has a couple little extras that are there to complement the controller itself. So if you're going to choose between these two controllers in particular, I would say the SN30 Pro is going to be better suited for classic and retro gaming. To me, the Pro 2 is something that you're going to leave in your living room, whereas the SN30 Pro is something you're going to put in your book bag to take with you to play retro games on the go. Okay, we spent a lot of time talking about the feel of this controller. Let's actually see how it performs. So the instruction manual comes in this kind of accordion style paper, and it has every single different connection that you can make. In a nutshell, you can use this on the Nintendo Switch, any Windows computer, any Android device, Mac OS, as well as iPhones and iPads. So let's pair it to my Android phone to see how this works. I'm going to switch the input over to the D, which is for D input or Android input. And then to start the pairing, you hit start to turn it on, and then you hold on to the pairing button. And you see at the bottom, it'll have that flashing light. So I'm going to scan for devices, and here it is. So let's go ahead and start it up. Let's try out an Android game first. We'll try with the Horizon Chase. And it feels good. There's probably a tiny bit of lag because of the Bluetooth connection, but I have to say it feels nice and tight, and I'm not noticing it myself. I'm not super sensitive to lag like I've mentioned before, but at the same time, it feels good to play. That's a win for me. And I have to say, I prefer using the D-pad with this. This is a very tight little D-pad, which makes it very nice for very precise controls on a driving game like this. I like it. Okay, so let's test out some classic games with RetroArch. Let's test out the turbo functionality here. So you hold down to the button you want to make turbo, and then you just hit the star button, and that turns it into turbo. And there you go, you just hold on to the button and it has a turbo function built in. And I believe you can actually do turbo for multiple buttons with this, which is very handy. But yeah, overall, it feels and controls well. Again, I'm not seeing a lot of lag here on RetroArch. But before we move on, what the heck is going on with this guy here? How is he shooting down while standing up like this? I don't know if I've ever seen this before. I've been playing this game for 30 plus years at this point. What the heck is up with this? If you guys know if this is a normal thing or just a weird glitch, let me know, because I've never seen that before. That's crazy. Like, I can't get over it. That's just crazy. Okay, let's try Nintendo Switch here. So we're going to move it over to the S function. Same thing here. We're going to hit start to start it up, and then we're going to hold on to the pairing button. And like with any other Switch controller, just hit the L and R buttons until it all gets set up. So gameplay on this also feels very good. I'm not discerning any lag here. And the function buttons work on this. So if you hit the star button, it'll take a picture. You hit the home button, it'll take you home. However, it will not wake the Switch from sleep when you're using it. So if you actually go to 8BitDo's website and you go into the support section, you can download and install specific software for this controller. So I'm going to do this here on my Mac, and let's check it out. It's as simple as just downloading an installer file, and then on the Mac you just have to move it over to your applications folder. Windows is going to be the same experience, you're just going to run an installer file. So I'm going to open up my applications folder and find it here, and you know all the Mac users are totally judging everything I have installed on my device, whatever. So just go ahead and open it up, and you're greeted with a screen here that says, hey, connect the controller to your computer using USB. As soon as I did that, it said, hey, there's a firmware update, and I did it. And as simple as that, you can update the firmware on the controller. Now, I had one of the original 8BitDo controllers many years ago, and I'll tell you, updating the firmware has gotten a lot easier over the years. This is a very handy tool. Now, once you're inside, you can make changes to the various systems that are supported. And all you basically have to do is use that switch on the back to switch it to whatever operating system you want to use it with, and then click on it. But word to the wise here, you cannot adjust Windows settings using the Mac app. But you can see here when you click on the others, it says, hey, switch over if you want to actually do this. So we're going to switch over to Android, and we'll go into the settings. And this is what the interface looks like. You can see up top there's a ribbon bar that has different tabs that you can do different controls on. Right now we're on the mapping tab. We'll get into that one here in a minute. So going into the analog sticks one, you can actually test for sensitivity. You can change the sensitivity. You can also invert the individual sticks. You can swap the sticks. And you can also swap the D-pad and the left stick inputs. Going over to the triggers here, you can see that they are definitely analog triggers. You can see the different sensitivities there. And you can also adjust these as well. So for example, if you push it down below 100, that means that once you hit that threshold, it's going to act like 100% at that point. Which means that if you want really quick triggers, you can just move this down even less. That means you have to push on it even less to get a full push. And that would be good if you're playing like a first-person shooter and you want to have a quick draw. You can also adjust the vibration across 5 different settings, 5 being the strongest, which is the default, or you can even take it down a few notches or just remove it altogether. And finally, there's a macros tab here. So this allows you to build your own combination of buttons and then assign them to any other button. So for example, if I want to assign everything to the P1 button, which is the right back button, I could go in here and put in both directional controls as well as buttons. And it's as simple as that. And then here you can also see there are 3 different profiles. So you can make different macros, different sensitivities for different profiles. So going back to that mapping tab here, this is kind of neat. You can actually assign any button to do any sort of function. So if you want your L2 and L1s to be swapped, whatever you want to do, you can change it in here. And this might be really handy for a specific game where you don't like the original layout. You can just go ahead and change it on the fly and override that original layout style. Now going over to the Switch side, it has all the same tabs except it's missing one tab, and that's the analog trigger tab. And that's because the Switch doesn't have analog triggers, it has digital triggers. So to me that makes sense that it's not available. So let's try pairing it with my Mac here. As you can see here, it actually thinks that it's a DualShock 4 controller, but it connected just fine. So let's actually try it with an emulator here on the Mac. This here is OpenEMU, my favorite emulator front end on Mac devices. You can go into the preferences here and under controls, and then I'm going to adjust it to NES. And then I can just quickly map everything here. And that's it. Simple as that. I've mapped everything on this controller. Okay, I got so many different games I can choose here. Let's try one I've never played before. Let's do this one here. It's called Contra. Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, and here we are. It controls just fine. And all the things I did in the previous shot where I was using turbo and stuff like that, they're all going to work on this as well. So yeah, across the board, Windows, Android, Switch, they all work just fine on this. So wrapping things up here, let's get back to that phrase I used before, in that a camel is a horse made by committee. And what I mean by this is that this controller is very functional. It works really well, it feels good in the hands. But part of me also feels like it's just like this mishmash of functions that altogether don't make a perfect controller. You have your SNES style front plate here, you've got these PS1 style grips, PS4 style analog sticks as well as triggers, and then weirdly coupled with those Super Nintendo shoulder buttons. Overall, the controller works, and it feels good, but at the same time, it feels like they just keep adding things to this controller without really taking a step back and thinking about, hey, are we actually doing the right thing here? And I get it, they're trying to make their own iconic design, but by basically just making a Frankenstein device here, I feel like they haven't made their own device. And maybe I'm being a little bit overly harsh on this controller, but at the end of the day, I feel like it looks better on paper than it does in the hands. And I guess when it comes down to it, that's why I find this Elitist S controller a little bit more compelling of a product. Yes, this one is definitely a ripoff of other controllers as well. It feels like a Nintendo Switch Pro controller with a little bit of Xbox functions to it, but at the same time it has this one single unified feel to it. I really like these triggers even though they're not analog triggers. And personally, I also really like the size of these face buttons. They feel really nice. And I definitely prefer these back buttons as well. They're very flush with the controller, but at the same time, they're very nice and tactile. I feel like they're not something you're going to push down on accidentally when you're playing. And I'm also one of those weird guys who prefers those offset analog sticks. And I think that preference is very individualized, and that might sway you one way or the other. So wrapping things up, keeping things in the spirit of this video here where I'm comparing the 8BitDo Pro 2 and the Elitist S, let's go over some of the differences here. Price-wise, they're about the same. The 8BitDo Pro 2 is about $5 more expensive, and I've seen a lot of sales for the Elitist S on Amazon, like 10% off coupons, things like that, so you might be able to grab this for as low as $40. The battery is larger on the Pro 2 as well as being replaceable, so I think that's a good thing. But the Elitist S has better connectivity options. For example, it has Bluetooth 5.0 instead of 4.0, it has that 2.4 GHz wireless dongle, so you can plug it into devices like the Super Console X, which does not have Bluetooth functionality, and still play wirelessly. Now both of these controllers can work with a wired connection, and I do prefer the Pro 2's USB-C connection. The Elitist S has gyroscopic controls for the Switch, but in reality I actually never use the gyroscopic controls, so your mileage may vary with that. Now one place where the Pro 2 really shines is the ability to refine your experience. So you can use that software to fully map all of your buttons, you can build your macros right there on the spot, and you can also adjust the sensitivity of your analog sticks and your analog triggers. And the layout is a big deal as well, right? If you like the Super Nintendo feel, as well as that PS4 feel and having those two analog sticks at the bottom, that's going to be important to you. Personally, I like the feel of the Xbox One and the Switch Pro where it has those offset analog sticks. So here's the thing, these are both great controllers, and they're about the same price. But I think they have two distinct use cases. The 8BitDo Pro 2 I think is going to be better for classic gaming because of that original style D-pad, and it's also going to be great for things like racing games which use an analog trigger. And then also if you like PS4 placement of your analog sticks, this is going to be a better fit for you. Now I think between the two, the Elitist S is better suited for Switch games, because you can actually wake the Switch up using the home button, which is a really great feature. And then it also has that Xbox or Nintendo style placement of the analog sticks. They're both great controllers, and they do about 90% of the same things, and that final 10% I think is really going to be up to you individually. So yeah, the phrase here that a camel is a horse made by a committee is the idea that something is functional but very ugly. And I'm not saying this controller is ugly, but what I am saying is that it lacks this sort of iconic feel to it. It doesn't feel like it's made by one handcrafted artist. And it's going to do all the things that you need it to do, but at the same time, I would be really interested to see if 8BitDo ever does a refresh at some point, where they make an entirely new IP that has all these functions, but with a design all their own. Because they obviously make very good controllers. I would just like them to make a controller that's fully theirs. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. I hope you liked it. And I really hope it's helpful for you if you have $50 and you're trying to decide which controller you want to buy. I think that when it comes down to it, these two controllers are the best two third-party controllers you can buy, and they're both great for their own reasons. I'd love to hear what you think in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming!